Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Namaduhu wa nasalli ala Rasulil al-Kareem. Viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is a history of the Muslims in the United States. The history of Muslims in the United States goes back to the 1950s. Before the 1950s, Islam was practically unheard of in the United States. The only Muslims in the United States before that time were the black Muslims. And this was because of a nationalist movement among the blacks in the United States, which was later known to be the Nation of Islam. This was mainly a reaction to the racism in the United States, and many blacks came into Islam because of the principle of equality in Islam. This attracted them, and they accepted Islam, but were not really in the practice of Islam. They did not really know much about the religion as such. And we know that some very prominent Americans came into the Nation of Islam as a result of the Nation of Islam movement, which was very popular among some blacks. People like the famous boxer Muhammad Ali and the famous political leader Malcolm X came to Islam through the Nation of Islam. And of course, later on, they found out that the Nation of Islam was mainly a political reaction to the racism in the United States, and it was not the real Islam. Slowly and gradually, people like that started coming into Islam and promoting or preaching the teachings of Islam in the United States. We know that around the 1960s, many Muslim students from different parts of the country started coming to the United States to study in American universities. This was actually the first beginning or the first movement towards the true Islam. These people came from Muslim backgrounds and started forming groups in the universities and colleges and started teaching people Islam to the students. And a lot of Americans were attracted to the teachings of Islam, and it started spreading in the educational institutions. People like Dr. Jamal Badawi, who came to the United States, even started programs teaching the true teachings of Islam. And by this time, a lot of people were interested in finding out. So their efforts to teach the true teachings of Islam were very fruitful. Around this time in the 1960s, when the students started coming, they first formed small groups in the universities, which later on became big groups, and they started building mosques. And the Friday prayers started, and the Eid prayers and so on. So the congregation started growing. So this was seen mostly in the 1960s, but it's still very small. And this only happened in big states like New York and California and Illinois and places like that. But the blacks who were originally in the Nation of Islam were now beginning to find out that Islam is not a racist or nationalist movement. It is a universal religion of peace. And people like Malcolm X, who had started with the Nation of Islam, then started coming to the mainstream Islam. So this was a big development in the history of Islam in the United States. So it's mainly started with the students, and as the population started increasing, the knowledge started spreading to different parts of the country. These students, most of them, settled down in the United States, and they started their families, and the population started increasing. So virtually in the 50s, 60s, one could say that there were not more than a few thousand Muslims all over the United States. But in the 60s and then later on in the 70s, the numbers started increasing dramatically. A lot of Americans started coming into Islam. In the beginning, it was mainly the blacks, and now the whites and other Hispanics and other groups started coming into Islam. And we know some prominent people among the whites started accepting, and some of them were Christian priests who started coming into Islam and started preaching the message of Islam. This movement kept growing, and in the 80s, there were now established masajids, mosques, in almost all the states of the United States. The numbers had increased dramatically, and by this time, the efforts, the preaching, the preachers of Islam were coming from different parts of the world to the United States, and there were now fairly big gatherings, and the gatherings that were not seen in the 70s and the 60s are now becoming big crowds, and the numbers and Friday prayers started increasing also. And the Muslims were now beginning to establish schools. The ones who had come in the 60s as students and had settled down, had families, the children were now growing up. So there was a need to have Islamic schools. And so around the 80s, they started establishing Islamic schools. And slowly and gradually, they started preaching actively to the American population. And by this time, the awareness was also growing, not only in the United States, but in Europe. In Europe, it started before the United States. It started mainly after World War II, when the immigrants, people from foreign countries started coming to Britain, Europe to work, and most of them were factory workers, and they started masajids. So the movement or the knowledge of Islam started spreading before in Europe than it started in the United States. In the United States, it was mainly the students who brought Islam to the United States, while in Europe, it was mainly the unskilled workers, people who had come from Asia and Africa, who had started the practice and started building masajids. So the two experiences are somewhat different. In the United States, people who were coming were mostly educated people who came for education, and they started establishing institutions. So by the 80s, the numbers had grown substantially, and the schools and the madrasas, places where children would go to memorize the Quran and learn Islam and Quran and Hadith as full-time students. And that started also. So by the 80s, it was fairly well established. The foundations had been laid. And the 90s saw the growth of these institutions. So virtually every state, and there were now not only a couple of masajids, but many masajids and many other institutions. So Muslims' presence was now being felt all over the country, especially in big cities like New York and Chicago and Los Angeles. These people were now bringing not only their institutions but the businesses started. The Muslim businesses, halal meat was now freely available. There was a time that it was almost impossible to get halal meat. People would have to travel long distances to get that. But once the Muslim population started growing, there was need for uh, halal meat and also businesses that were halal. So now the businesses started sprouting, especially in areas where there were masajids and big Muslim populations. So the community was now becoming fairly well established, not only in Islam but also in business and in worldly matters. So the 90s saw a very big growth and very big gatherings started taking place, especially in Ramadan and Eids. So numbers started growing in thousands. So in a short period of about 20, 30 years, from virtually zero population to now hundreds of thousands. So it was a dramatic increase, and few people could have imagined that it would be such a big increase in such a short time. People who had built masajids, small masajids, became very small for the congregations, and they had to expand and buy lands and buildings to accommodate the growing number of people. The institutions were now being established to accommodate students, to teach them the teachings of Islam. And new Muslims coming into Islam also needed institutions where they could study Arabic, where they could study the Quran and the Hadith. So now it was spreading in the whole population. And it was not just the blacks, it was the whites and other groups. So in the 90s, there was a big growth in the population. And in the year 2000, of course, by this time, Islam had become very well known all over the United States. And of course, after 9/11, there was a lot of news, and of course, it was negative news. So now Muslims were becoming the targets of extremists, people who had seen a dramatic rise of Muslim institutions in the United States, who were worried that this might mean domination by a foreign group. So there was a big reaction after 9/11. But ironically, a lot of Muslims, a lot of people came into Islam after the knowledge had come to them, when they started studying Islam and they realized that Islam is not what had been projected in the media. It was not a violent religion. It was a religion of peace, and it was being misunderstood by some individuals and bringing a bad name to the religion. So many people came into Islam as a result of that negative propaganda. That was the irony of that media attacks on Islam. The Muslims started now educating the public and explaining to them what is true Islam and what is not, or what is misunderstood Islam. So scholars like Dr. Naik, who were now preaching almost all over the world the true teachings of Islam, who had the advantage of the English language. The people like that who were not just knowledgeable in Islam, but also knowledgeable in science and knowledgeable in the Western culture. They were explaining to the Western audiences what true Islam is. And these people established institutions and interacted with other faiths, and many people from other faiths started coming to Islam. People like Yusuf Estes, the American, who later on who became a Muslim as a result of his contact with a Muslim and as a result of his observing the Muslim practices, became a preacher for Islam. People like Dr. Gerald Dirks, who was a Christian priest who went to study religion at Harvard and then later on accepted Islam, and then he started preaching Islam. These kind of people started coming up in the 90s, and in the year 2000, they were now coming in public. They were going to conferences, attending seminars, giving speeches. So Islam was now becoming very well known in the United States. But at the same time, there was a big backlash in the media because the people opposed to Islam, they were worried that it has grown to such an extent in such a short time that it may become the dominant religion in the United States. So as a result of that, a campaign started against the Muslims, but even with all the opposition, it was not able to stop the growth of Islam. So now, after many years of education, Islam is now one of the main religions in the United States. And people are seeing the practices of Islam right in their neighborhoods. There was a time when they only heard of Islam through the media, through the books. But now they are seeing Islam in practice in their neighborhoods, and they see where the Muslims are practicing. They are the most peaceful, they are the most law-abiding citizens. They don't have any drug problems, they don't have any alcohol problems, they don't have any family issues. They're very close families. They're seeing a lot of change in the society. It's a very different picture from what they had been seeing before. So this concludes the first part of the history of the Muslims in the United States. Wa akhir dawana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.